they're basically accusing her of holding her own husband hostage. Literally, they use that word. Even The Guardian was covering this. Last week, Brooklyn Beckham, the 26-year-old son of Victoria and David Beckham, posted a 7-slide essay to Instagram stories accusing his parents of controlling his entire life and disrespecting his wife, Nicola Pelz. Immediately, he was hit with a tidal wave of backlash. The internet rallied around Victoria and David, and social media was flooded with claims that Brooklyn was Prince Harry 2.0. Yet another privileged son being manipulated by an evil woman into betraying his family. Conservative influencers have pounced on this drama, with major figures on the right like Candace Owens, Brett Cooper, House and Habit, and more, pushing the idea that Nicola Peltz is yet another Meghan Markle, while commenters accuse Brooklyn of being toxic for cutting off his family. While this all might seem like meaningless celebrity drama, there's actually a lot more going on behind the scenes than you might think. And the controversy reveals a lot about how our culture treats men, the normalization of gender-based violence, and how propaganda works in the digital age. To break all of this down, I have my friend Kat Tenbarge here. Kat is the author of Spitfire News, and she wrote a great piece on all this week. Kat, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So excited to have you here. For a lot of people in the US, I kind of want to give a little bit of background on who Brooklyn Beckham is, because I feel like he's a huge superstar almost to a lot of people in the UK. He's almost like a second royal prince, but at least here in the US, he's not as big. I would call him like a B- list celebrity. He's more of like a Nepo baby, I feel like, than anything else. So let's start with Brooklyn and give a little 101 on his life, and then we'll sort of talk about, what's happening now. So Brooklyn Beckham was born on March 4th, 1999. He's the oldest child of Posh Spice, Victoria Beckham, and David Beckham. And when he was born, it was almost like another royal wedding, because you have to remember, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, was quite literally the peak of Posh and Beck's fame. Like, Spice Girls were a massive thing. David Beckham is a star football player. Like, this was like the golden child of England. And he grew up pretty much throughout the aughts, like very much in the public eye. I barely remember these days, but I do remember like reading the tabloid newspapers and being like, oh, they have this son.
It strikes me as like the Family Channel before Family Channels. That was the level of attention and exposure he was getting from being basically an infant or before he was even born.
Yeah, he's kind of the original child of family influencers. From the beginning of his life, he's positioned as kind of like the heir to the throne of the Beckham fortune. He is positioned in David's footsteps. They enroll him in soccer classes, and he's just like constantly living in the public eye. The soccer stuff really broke my heart, because you see in these tabloid headlines, and like throughout that time, I remember it was like this young, 13, 14, 15-year-old, and they're like pushing him. They sent him to like the Arsenal Summer Academy or Soccer Academy, something or other. But it was clear that he like wasn't that good at soccer, and also that his heart was just not in it.
Yes. And this is the first impression that I really remember getting of Brooklyn Beckham, because I was super young, like a baby myself, when the Posh and Beck's era was at its peak. But I remember being a teenager, and like my introduction to really hearing about this guy was like, he's not as good as his dad at soccer, and people were making fun of him. And he was a child at the time too. So he was already kind of being humiliated by the public just for not being like particularly talented when he never even asked to be.
Yeah, it's like, I feel like all of media, they always want the son, right, to be as good as the father. And especially when it comes to professional athletes, like you see this time and time again. University of Colorado, is where I went to school. And like we have Deion Sanders, and we had, Shedeur Sanders, his son. And it's like, it was this whole thing of like, can he be as good as Deion? And it's like, no hate to Shedeur, he's amazing. Or any of, Deion's other sons. But it's like, it's so rarely can the son of a famous athlete live up to their famous father, because being a professional athlete and being that good is kind of like a genetic lottery thing, and you don't necessarily pass that on to your kids.
Yeah, and I feel like it's not that unusual for people's kids to not have the exact same talents or interests or passions that they do, but it's such an eldest child dynamic where it's like, depending on the type of parents, a lot of times like the most intense expectations are placed on the eldest child.
And it's clear, from Brooklyn's teenage years that he's kind of more of like an artsy kid. He's more kind of like introspective, kind of creative. He starts in 2014 and 2015 working as a fashion photographer. So he starts to pursue photography. He photographs lots of celebrities and models for magazines. He shot a campaign for Burberry. Obviously, these are opportunities that he's getting because of his position as a Nepo baby. But I think he also tried to give it a shot. Like, it's clearly an interest of his. He enrolled in Parsons School of Design, which, you know, is a really good school just to get into. Maybe he got in because he's a Nepo baby. He did end up leaving just a year later, which is when he published his photography book called What I See. This was like a book that was in Urban Outfitters, and the photos were... I just want to say that because, like, people are judging this book so hard now that this drama has resurfaced. And it's like, guys, the quality of Urban Outfitters books is not exactly high.
It's so true. It's like, this is another one of the main impressions I think people have of Brooklyn Beckham because it's gone so viral, especially now. But like, excerpts from that photography book, and specifically the picture of the elephants where they're completely in the shade, and the caption is like, elephants, like, so cool to see but so hard to photograph. And it is really, really funny. That being said, like, he can clearly, like, shoot photos if he's done all of these campaigns and he's, like, taken classes. I just think that it feeds into this narrative about him that will be really hard to ever go away, even if he does develop more talent, which is just that, like, he's been branded as a talentless fail son. And it's kind of mean the way that people go about it.
I mean, I was looking at some of those photos myself, and it's so funny, too, because on our last episode when Matt was on with us also talking about his teen photography career, like, okay, Matt's photos are honestly better than Brooklyn's, but like, I feel like this is something that actually a lot of teens, especially in the 2010s, were into, because like, photography since Instagram started in 2010, like, became this more accessible thing. DSLRs were suddenly like more accessible to more people. And it was just, I don't know, it was this era I felt like where everyone had, I was living in Williamsburg during, the early 2010s, but it was like everyone had a camera. It was very cool. Everyone had their own like little like photo blog or Tumblr or whatever. And when I see his photo book, like, it just looks like a lot of Tumblr photos. Like, you know, they're not great. If he wasn't a Nepo baby, he wouldn't have gotten that. But at this point too, I would say he's also kind of an influencer.
Well, it reminds me so much of Kim Kardashian's selfie coffee table book, which was like such a smash hit. And like, also, Kim Kardashian, arguably like somewhat of a Nepo baby because of her family connections and wealth that she grew up into. So it's like, it was totally a thing at the time. And I, at the time, remember really liking these books. I was like a teenager. I was in kind of the market for this type of stuff. So I think it, especially with the circumstances of today, people are viewing it through a really harsh lens.
I had the Kim Kardashian selfie book on my like coffee table in my Brooklyn apartment because it was like cool and funny and ironic. Yeah. So, I mean, listen, I think he starts to develop like an online following around then too. Like I wouldn't say he has like fans, but he certainly has a lot of people watching his every move, again, because he grew up very famous and he's the child of these two famous, megastars in the UK. So he's kind of flailing along. In 2019, he starts to develop this interest in cooking right around the time where he also meets this woman, Nicola Pelz. If you're watching this video and you like my work, please support me on Patreon via the link below or buy a paid subscription to my tech and online culture newsletter at usermag.co. That's usermag.co. I don't have any long-term brand partnerships, and a lot of my content is effectively demonetized. I've lost major brand deals for speaking out on certain issues and for challenging power. As you can imagine, advertisers are not exactly eager to work with somebody who covers a lot of the topics that I cover and talks about the things that I talk about. These videos I make are entirely funded by you, and I can't continue to make them without your support. So if you get any value out of the videos that I create and you want me to be able to create more, please support me on Patreon or Substack via the links below. On Patreon, I do bonus episodes, monthly Q&A live streams, and post frequent updates about my work. My Substack newsletter gives you a bi-weekly roundup of everything that I'm seeing and reading and paying attention to online. You can also get my newsletter on Patreon. Once again, the links to everything are below in the description. Every dollar of your support makes such a difference. It's a very quick kind of meeting. Like, they meet in October 2019, and by July 2020, they're engaged. I just remember being like, oh my God, they're so young, when all this happened. But it's like, you can tell he's kind of searching for meaning. And it seems like he found this woman that really he jives with and they get along. Also, like, the COVID pandemic is happening. But like the earliest days, I think like everyone was moving in with people, accelerating their relationships. I don't know. This is when Brooklyn moves to the US, though, and starts to become sort of more private and tied in with Nicola's family. So do you want to talk a little bit about like who Nicola Peltz is and the family that she comes from? Because she's not like a celebrity, but she's powerful.
Yes. So I had never heard of these people before like recent events transpired. Like Nicola in particular, I had never heard of her before, but I had heard of her dad. I just didn't really know because her dad is like this huge like conservative billionaire figure, and he did two things that I think are like pretty newsworthy. He has like claimed that he introduced Donald Trump and Elon Musk to each other, and he's like a close associate of both of them. He also tried to do an activist takeover of Disney. There was a big Disney corporate drama last year where a bunch of people were trying to like aim for succession of the company, and he launched this like hostile takeover bid partially in an effort to make the company more conservative. So I followed that drama. And so knowing that that was her dad, I was like, oh, her dad sucks. And she has a very close relationship with him. If you go on her Instagram, she posts pictures with him all the time. And like clearly like he is her beloved father. So going into it, I would say I didn't have like the best impression of her, but it didn't really have any bearing to me on like Brooklyn or his relationship with his family. I was just like, oh, her dad sucks.
Yeah, her dad is terrible. She grew up in Westchester County, New York. She goes to private school. She's, as you mentioned, the daughter of Nelson Peltz and a model. She's Ashkenazi Jewish, and she began acting as a child. She actually went to professional children's school in Manhattan, which is where a lot of like famous actors go. She's only been in a couple things. She was in like a holiday comedy. She was in The Last Airbender. She's been in like a couple things, but certainly I think is mostly a Nepo baby herself. She did previously date the model Anwar Hadid. So she's just kind of around. I mean, her dad is also a huge Zionist. So it's very like, rich Israel, pro-Israel kind of New York Nepo baby, Hollywood adjacent life. So, it makes sense that she'd like find herself tied in with someone like Brooklyn. And again, we don't know her politics specifically. Her dad is abhorrent, but who knows? It's your dad. Like, everybody sees their family with rose-colored glasses, but it is bleak that her father introduced Musk and Trump. And God, I wish that didn't happen.
It's also like when I think about David and Victoria Beckham, I think that they are more liberal for sure than Nelson Peltz. However, both of them have been awarded titles by like the British monarchy, and they've both really like cozied up and been obsessed with like the royals. So you also have like a white supremacist structure that they similarly are like indebted to and obsessed with in the same way with all of their like power and privilege. So I feel like they're honestly kind of cut from the same cloth in terms of like what the families prioritize and how their kids have been inflated by all of this.
Well, both families, I think, are a lot about like wealth and power. And I guess the Beckhams are also more about image. They were known for like obsessively curating their image. I mean, this was like a whole thing with when Posh and Bex got together. Like everybody was like, oh my gosh, right, the two most self-obsessed, image-obsessed like celebrities out there are, together. Isn't that hilarious? I also think that at the end of the day, these mega rich people really only have class solidarity with other mega rich people. And Posh and Bex, I have never, ever seen to be like social justice warriors or progressive in any way.
I've seen people try to do kind of a revisionist history around this where they're like, they were so upset about Nelson Peltz's views and like they didn't want to be associated with Trump and all of this. And I'm like, publicly, they don't want to be associated with that. But that doesn't mean that they are great people behind the scenes. Like, if anything, it's performative. And a lot of this press and stuff, they have such a close relationship with positive press and being able to generate that type of PR around themselves.
To jump back to our timeline, it's like 2020, they get engaged. He's getting more into cooking. People are lambasting him for this. He starts putting these cooking videos on Instagram and YouTube. He's, I would say, really leaning into his like influencer career. He also also launches a Snapchat series, Cookin' with Brooklyn. And everyone got really mad at him for this as well, because it had this kind of like, there was a production budget behind it and he didn't have formal cooking training. And, he's doing things like taking a blowtorch to like a grilled cheese sandwich, which people were mocking him for. I think, again, it's just like clearly this rich young influencer guy, like trying to find himself, trying to express himself. Like maybe he is really into cooking, And yes, he does have all these opportunities because he's rich and young and a Nepo baby. So that sort of like evolves. And then we get to April 2022, which is Brooklyn and Nicola's massive viral wedding in Palm Beach. This is when Nicola really came on my radar, because the Daily Mail covered this wedding with a ferociousness that like you have never seen. And I read like every single story. They're married in this really high profile Jewish ceremony, but tensions arose kind of very quickly. Specifically, the first one is around the dress.
So like, even though I didn't really care about these people, as like really heavily covered things in the tabloid media often become, it was inescapable. I was seeing these headlines about like what was going on at this wedding, like all of these rumors, all of this scrutiny. And the dress narrative that came out very quickly was that Victoria Beckham, who is a fashion designer who has like a very popular fashion brand and like designs couture garments, had agreed to design a dress for Nicola for the wedding and then backed out at the last minute. So Nicola had to like scramble to find another option.
Yeah. And it's kind of unclear what the real story is with this. Like when this news broke, there was also people that, especially now, are going back and pointing to this old Vogue article, which said that, actually her Valentino gown was in the works for over a year and she had visited Rome and people had flown from Italy, just to do these fittings with her. And like, so it wasn't some overnight thing. I think brides often have multiple dresses these days at weddings. So, I think Valentino was probably designing the one that she walked down the aisle, but the one that she was planning to wear for most of the rest of the night could have very easily supposed to have been like a Victoria Beckham design.
100%, especially with a wedding. This is like a $1 billion wedding. Like this is a wedding from a billionaire family. So like, I actually think that for sure she was planning to wear multiple dresses. I could only see her wearing the Valentino dress throughout the whole wedding from like what I was seeing when doing some basic research. She might have had some other ones that she tried on, but I was like, it honestly struck me as weird that she didn't have a big costume change. And so to me, the story that Victoria was like supposed to make her a dress and then pulled out makes a lot of sense. Because I found it odd that she didn't have more wedding dresses on her wedding day.
Yeah, so there's that drama. And then there's the other big sort of viral controversy that's emerged from this, which is this first dance question. So according to Brooklyn, in this Instagram statement that he released later, Victoria Beckham basically stole the first dance from Nicola. Mark Anthony was performing. I guess he was on stage. He said something about like, can the most beautiful woman in the room come up? And I guess Victoria got up instead of Nicola. Maybe he meant for her to come up. I don't know. It was very confusing. But essentially, Victoria Beckham ends up doing this dance with Brooklyn that Brooklyn later calls highly inappropriate and said that it made him very uncomfortable. To me, this sounds like classic boy mom stuff. If you watch this stuff on TikTok, like there's a lot of boy moms that essentially treat their son, especially their oldest son, as like almost a second partner. And they view that son's wedding as like their wedding almost to their son. It's like a weird psychological thing. So to me, this sounded like kind of, I was like, okay, classic boy mom behavior.
It also just makes me laugh because I spend a lot of time reading wedding subreddits, like wedding shaming, and people post stuff like this all the time where it's anonymous and obviously no one has Mark Anthony at their wedding besides celebrities. But like this setup of my mother-in-law was like a monster at my wedding. Like my mother-in-law tried to steal the spotlight. She wore a white dress. She stole the first dance. Like these are very common occurrences that people go through. And what's also funny is I often think that these stories are exaggerated. But when something like this comes out, I'm like, damn, I guess people really do act like this at weddings.
Yeah. And everybody's like trawling the internet begging to see video of this, which I'm sure any video of this is just going to be torn apart by either side and everyone's going to overly litigate it. But I will say a few wedding guests spoke to the New York Post and said that basically Brooklyn was telling the truth. Stavros Agapiou, the partner of a British DJ who was asked to perform at the wedding, he posted a comment on Instagram saying, I was there, she did, he's telling the truth. So yeah, she probably was a little inappropriate. You know, maybe she had a couple too many glasses of wine. Like, who knows? Who knows? But like you said, you know, this is actually pretty common wedding drama, and there's billionaires involved and famous people, but like, they're not the first people to deal with this. But I will say, like, this drama kind of died. Like, this is all, I just want to reiterate, like, back in 2022. This is a while ago. So this is not like any sort of thing that like gets that much traction. By the next year, actually, they were denying any feud. Nicola said, you know, she has a great relationship with the Beckhams. She called speculation on the feud really untrue and weird. And Netflix releases this mini documentary style reality series about the Beckhams on October 4th, 2023. It's a limited series. And at the Netflix launch event, another video goes viral, and it looks to be like Victoria Beckham just locked in this Instagram on the red carpet and kind of like ignoring or stiffing Nicola and Brooklyn. And so this kind of opens up a lot of speculation again, where they're like, okay, wait a minute, you guys said you didn't have a feud, but like, why is Victoria being so cold to Nicola at this red carpet event?
And one of the main framing of these stories as they're coming out, like after the wedding over the years, from what I'm seeing online, is like people are accusing Nicola of being the problem.
Yes, she's very much framed as the problem. And actually by March 2025, when David Beckham has this massive 50th birthday party in Miami and Brooklyn and Nicola are not there, there's a lot of speculation that like Nicola didn't want to show up, or Nicola kept Brooklyn from showing up because, you know, XYZ family feud. I guess there was like some sort of accusations that one of the other brothers was dating an ex. That girl came out and said, actually, they weren't dating. But like, essentially, people started to focus in on Nicola as like the problem and, you know, like the reason that Brooklyn wasn't at his father's 50th birthday party. That again kind of blows over. And then we get to now, almost a year later, January 2026, seemingly kind of out of nowhere. At least I wasn't paying attention to Brooklyn's Instagram before this. Brooklyn posts this multi-part Instagram stories. I don't want to call it a rant because I think it's like it's a vent, maybe. It's all about essentially his estrangement from his family. And I want to kind of go through it. I don't want to read the whole thing, but I want to go through some highlights. Here, Kat, I'm just going to chat you that if you want to pull it up. So do you want to read just the first page so people can get a taste of kind of what this series of stories kind of is communicating?
So Brooklyn opens this by writing, I have been silent for years and made every effort to keep these matters private. Unfortunately, my parents and their team have continued to go to the press, leaving me with no choice but to speak for myself and tell the truth about only some of the lies that have been printed. I do not want to reconcile with my family. I'm not being controlled. I'm standing up for myself for the first time in my life. For my entire life, my parents have controlled narratives in the press about our family. The performative social media posts, family events, and inauthentic relationships have been a fixture of the life I was born into. Recently, I've seen with my own eyes the lengths that they'll go through to place countless lies in the media, mostly at the expense of innocent people, to preserve their own facade. But I believe the truth always comes out.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, this seemed to come out of nowhere, but when I went back and looked, there were actually a lot of really negative headlines about Brooklyn and Nicola for the past year that really seemed to accelerate after David's 50th birthday. So in the New York Post, they ran this headline last July that said, Nicola Peltz slammed for flaunting Brooklyn Beckham at her dad's birthday after skipping David's party. And it just goes on to kind of like savage her. You had also around that time a People magazine article saying that Nicola Peltz Beckham likes Instagram comment that calls the idea that she's controlling husband Brooklyn Beckham absurd. Essentially, I guess she liked some comment defending herself, and this became like this whole narrative. There were a lot of headlines actually calling her controlling and abusive and all of this awful stuff. Hello magazine, a big European tabloid, ran this story of Nicola Peltz responds to claims she's controlling Brooklyn Beckham. Brooklyn has become estranged from the wider Beckham family. And you just see this narrative. I mean, even on Reddit, right, which is where a lot of these narratives emerge, you see people start to really turn on Nicola. Somebody posted a while ago, why doesn't anyone talk about how Nicola Peltz, Brooklyn Beckham's girlfriend, was so abusive to her childhood nannies that some were rumored to, want to take their life while working for, just basically being like, she's evil, she's terrible. Now, again, do I think that this Nepo girl was maybe awful? Sure. But it's kind of crazy. I mean, they're basically accusing her of holding her own husband hostage. Literally, they use that word. Even The Guardian was covering this, saying essentially that Brooklyn Beckham has caused this family to have a meltdown while he's raking it in.
It makes my blood boil so much for multiple reasons. One of which is like, with these news outlets, they cower in fear at accurately describing the actions of abusive men. But the same does not apply when the woman, like when the person in power in question is a woman, because she has these billions of wealth behind her, but they're not afraid of saying things that could be literally, defamatory. Like they're laying out this whole narrative. There's no evidence of it. They're like choosing to write these headlines in a way that implies that it's true. This narrative is all too familiar against women, whether they are wealthy and privileged or not. It plays out all of the time. This idea that wives are isolating their husbands and taking them away from their paternal families, when in reality, like, it typically strips the husband's agency completely. The story is so much more often that like the husband doesn't want to put in the effort to see his family or doesn't like his family, but it's all blamed on his wife. So that's like exactly what like the tone of this coverage is taking, even though the narrative that Brooklyn lays out is much more believable, because we know that David and Victoria have had this like relationship with the media for so long and have used it to essentially control him for so long.
Again, this has been a thing since the 90s, where like Posh and Bex have just been experts at wielding tabloid attention and directing tabloid attention to kind of bolster their image, bolster the image of their family. This is a kid that grew up being scrutinized by the tabloids and, viciously torn apart. And you can tell that he's clearly like a sensitive guy, right? That's like wants to do his art and his cooking and his things and like doesn't want to like have the limelight in the same way that his father did, or become a sports soccer superstar, and it seems like there's so much pressure put on him, and it seems like he's gotten some sort of reprieve in his relationship with Nicola. And he even posts in one of the later slides on that Instagram, series of stories, he says, the narrative that my wife controls me is completely backwards. I have been controlled by my parents for most of my life. I grew up with overwhelming anxiety. For the first time in my life since stepping away from my family, that anxiety has disappeared. I wake up every morning grateful for the life I chose and have found peace and relief. My wife and I do not want a life shaped by image, press, or manipulation. All we want is peace, privacy, and happiness for us and our future family. And I think this is true. He had his little Snapchat cooking show 5 years ago, but like he's not really out doing that. You have his parents selling this Netflix reality series on them, doing these high profile events, like celebrity studded, things, doing a lot of posting on Instagram, frankly. And Brooklyn and Nicola just don't seem, yes, they're rich and they go to these like charity events, but they're not out trying to be celebrities in the same way.
Yes, no, I think people act really purposefully obtuse about this part of the statement and about this idea in general, which is like, Brooklyn and Nicola are never going to have a completely normal life where they can escape the press entirely. And they know that. And people act like them having this status as a public figure is somehow A, their fault when they were born into it, and B, something that like if they engage with the public, it's like, how can you say you want privacy? But what the reality is like the Beckham relationship with the media is so much more intrusive and intense than what they want. So that is what they are really expressing, I think, when they say that they want privacy and in how they're behaving.
Well, also, like, if you go on his Instagram, it's such a normie Instagram. Like, he's posting, my girl wrapped her movie today. Love you so much. He's like boosting her up. He's posting his like very mediocre looking, like, I don't know, British food is also gross to me, but like shepherd's pie or whatever. And you have this is weeks ago, you have people saying Meghan Markle, male version. Here for the comments. No one cares about your shepherd's pie. Family blocked, last name kept. Even on Christmas Day, he posts this picture of him and Nicola just saying, we wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year filled with so much love, peace, and happiness. The top comment is Perez Hilton, always at the scene of the crime, saying, everyone, all caps, except your in-laws. And the comments are just vicious. And of course, it hasn't taken long either for conservative influencers to hop right on this celebrity drama and start using it for their own narratives. You know, you have a lot of these people, these reactionary YouTubers calling this Meghan Markle 2.0, Meghan and Harry 2.0, and drawing all of these parallels and essentially saying like, you know, all that hate you feel towards Meghan Markle? Well, now we have a new one. You know, Nicola is the new evil witch and we need to destroy her and tear apart Brooklyn. And I also think one other thing that's notable, speaking of the family name, is that he actually took his wife's name. He goes by Brooklyn Beckham. So I just think that's interesting too, because it's rare that a man takes a wife's name. And I think it's kind of cool that he did that and that they both share this sort of both of their names, basically. And you see a lot of people kind of lambasting that in the comments as well.
Well, it's no surprise that conservative influencers are covering this story because so much of the backlash is rooted in conservative ideology. And it's no surprise that like doing something like taking your wife's last name is so unusual because it upsets the patriarchal status quo of like who takes whose last name, who is supposed to have allegiance to whose family, yada, yada, yada. It is no surprise that like these conservative figures, that is part of the emotional rhetoric underlining their argument, is like it is bashing Brooklyn and Nicola for going against what is expected in like a traditional family, which is that children are subservient to their parents and have to be grateful for whatever their parents give them, even if what they're giving them is literally just like abuse and harassment in the press. And people act like Brooklyn and Nicola are instigating this conflict by like having Brooklyn release this statement on his Instagram stories. But the reality is, just like Harry and Meghan, the royal family, as well as the Beckhams, they have this machinery around them, this PR machinery that is covert because their names aren't necessarily bylines on the Daily Mail coverage or what the Mirror is saying. But as the public, we can expect, and Brooklyn, you know, is basically outlining this, they have these relationships behind the scene with the media. So they are able to control and contribute to these smear campaigns that are happening in the public eye against their children.
Well, you can just see this smear campaign in action if you scroll back and look at the comments on his Instagram account and the headlines in the press that he's gotten. And I think it's hard because like for a lot of people, I mean, I've known this with myself because I've gotten my fair share of bad press. Okay. I have negative headlines about myself, whatever. I'm certainly not a celebrity like Brooklyn Beckham, but if you're in the media or you're outspoken on these issues, someone's going to write some stupid, you know, hit piece about you, even NPR. It's so funny because in your world, it feels so overwhelming and it very directly affects your life. And you forget that 99% of people actually aren't even reading that, or they're just like scrolling it literally while they're on the toilet, like quickly and moving on. But it can feel oppressive and overwhelming. And so I can totally understand why like he was sort of suffering with this for like years potentially. You can literally go back and just read all the negative headlines that were snowballing. And I'm sure it got to a breaking point, as you said, kind of similar with Harry and Meghan, where it gets to a breaking point. That person is like, hey, okay, I'm setting a boundary. I'm snapping. I can't do this anymore. Like I'm speaking out. And then that is framed as the story. And then that is almost what breaks through even more to the mainstream. And people are like, whoa, why are you freaking out? And it's like, you try reading a bad headline about yourself every single week for a year and see how you feel. You're going to be wanting to go on Instagram too and rant because like it's infuriating. And these tabloid news outlets and even mainstream news outlets, like they don't really care. So much of it is about just like sort of throwing people under the bus. And that's what a lot of the news is. And a lot of these news journalists, like journalists in quotes, they just want to cozy up to power. They're not in their job because they want to expose the truth, especially some of these, I mean, I was going to say entertainment reporters, but media reporters as well. I'll bring it back to like people at NPR and other places like this, where they will knowingly print lies. These media reporters, these, you know, tabloid people, like, because they just want to, they'll print lies that they know are, you know, maybe lies that, for instance, like a CEO or a rich person or a celebrity or somebody in power wants to get out there. And by printing those lies, they're able to ingratiate themselves with these people in power. And that's all they care about. And so Posh and Bex are like this huge, you know, powerful couple in the UK. They're very connected. They're very in celebrity. And so, of course, all these, you know, journalists are just going to be lackeys to them. They're not going to take the side of this like 25-year-old in the US who's like married to some Nepo girl. Like, they don't have any power. And they're out here saying, we don't actually want to be part of this machine. We want out of it, which is the same thing that Harry and Meghan said actually themselves.
It is so similar to the Harry and Meghan situation, minus, of course, like the anti-Black racism that was at the heart of like so much of what Meghan Markle endured. However, like similarly, you have people in the press literally posting selfies with David and Victoria Beckham because they idolize them and they cover them. These are like beat reporters on this story producing so much of this coverage. They idolize David and Victoria. They blame everything on Nicola. And they even go so far as to say, like, Brooklyn Beckham didn't really write this statement. This isn't how he really feels. Like, verbatim, that is what I was seeing reporters post about this. It's like an upside down world, like a total conspiracy.
Well, also just back to these like conservative narratives, like I think of even just Brett Cooper, who I was watching her video on this, where she's like, unsurprising, you know, this is happening in a world where people cut off their close family members over politics. And it's just like, you guys are telling on yourselves. You guys are telling on yourselves because like, this is what you hear so constantly from so many of these like MAGA, like abusive parents. And again, not to say that there's not a lot of liberal abusive parents, but like, it's very much like this like MAGA kind of like to the point that it's a meme now, right? Where it's like, my son, you know, I've terrorized my baby boy for 35 years and now he won't come home for Christmas because I said that I don't believe he's gay. You know, why does he have to cut off the family? It's like, what?
That's one of the reasons why it's so frustrating to me that people buy into like the Nicola is the enemy, Nicola is the instigator theory, because it makes so much more sense and is like such a common story that happens to all types of people, where it's like the parents don't approve of the eldest son's wife because when he's with her and when he marries her, they lose control over him. And he's been controlled his whole life. So she presents a threat to them, which is that they can no longer control their son to the same degree that they could before. So then they smear her as the problem. And this doesn't usually happen on the front page of the Daily Mail. It usually just happens in private families everywhere. But it is an all too common narrative that plays out against women. And that's also why it doesn't matter if Nicola like loves her Trump supporting dad or if Brooklyn like doesn't make great Instagram reels. Like it literally has no bearing on who they are as people. This is such a common like misogynistic trope. And so all of these people jumping on this bandwagon in support of that trope is bad, regardless of who's being affected by it.
Well, also, I think it's so revealing that all these conservatives are trying to use this drama when it's like, aren't you happy that he's cozying up to this billionaire pro-Trump family? Like, ironically, it's kind of reminiscent of the Baldoni kind of lively stuff too, where it's like ironic, not that, you know, Justin was some like actual woke king or whatever, but like, it's just so funny because they will throw everything out the window. You know, like if this was a different situation and Nicola came out and was like, actually, I don't like being with my like lib celebrity in-laws, David and Posh Becks, or just like lib celebrity terrible people, like they would be like, defend the family, we stand with Brooklyn or whatever. But because it's Brooklyn, a man setting boundaries with his parents, like it's just, they can just lean into the misogyny and push all these misogynistic tropes about Nicola and use it in that way. Like they just don't have any actual consistency or moral consistency. It's all about like, how can we just like take whatever situation is out there and leverage it for our own agenda?
Yes. I mean, patriarchal structures start at home. They start within the family. And it is so critical to the entire conservative movement that people like love patriarchal power structures. And ironically, like a lot of liberals will point out that Trump supporters like love that he's like this abusive dad type figure. But everyone gets in on celebrity drama when the targets of the smear campaigns are rich, privileged people, because it's like people feel as though they deserve it. And that it doesn't matter, and that it's frivolous, and that because they're not very sympathetic victims, then it's totally fine for everyone to like join these hate bandwagons against them.
Yeah, which is just Meghan Markle, Blake Lively, Amber Heard, like all of it. And you hear all of these names being thrown around again in the comment section of posts like this and the Reddit threads, et cetera. It's like, here's another uppity woman, you know, who is, upsetting this sort of traditional role.
I also think it's interesting that to me, Nicola is like, she is a figure that like for myself personally, I don't feel a lot of individual sympathy with her. I feel sympathy for her with regards to what is happening in this dynamic right now. But rather than criticize her for real things like her dad and like her allegiance to him, people feel the need to make up insane lies. And that is such a hallmark of a smear campaign, is like the lies, it has to become so exaggerated. So one thing that I see all the time in these viral tweets is like, I love Posh Spice, she's a foundational mother, and Nicola pushed her nanny down the stairs and killed her. And I find that so fascinating because that never happened. It is such a viral smear. No nanny was pushed down the stairs at the Peltz family household and died. Like that just, there's no record of that. There's no evidence of that. It's totally fabricated. So why do they feel the need to tell these like gratuitous details? It's because they have to sort of like repair this cognitive dissonance around like how ridiculous their position is.
Yes, it really is. I mean, I think like what you said is so true, because Nicola is probably, like you said, her allegiance to her father is suspect. Like she is a billionaire Nepo, like I highly doubt that I agree with her on a lot of things politically. But yeah, in this instance, I think it's just very clear kind of why the right is trying to use this story and why this is going so viral and why there's so much vicious hate against her and Brooklyn.
And it really is vicious. I've seen viral tweets that are like, she looked terrible on her wedding day, which is not true. She was wearing like thousands upon thousands. Like, of course she didn't look terrible on her wedding day. Like these smears are so ridiculous. And again, when it's such a privileged, like controversial white woman, there is no depth to how low people will go. They will just say like the nastiest, most misogynistic things and feel that that is okay. And like also on the flip side, the stan culture around Victoria Beckham and trying to excuse her and say that she could never do anything wrong because people love the Spice Girls and they love Posh Spice so much. It's stan brained. It's so ridiculous.
It's all the stan account. I mean, if you look up like Brooklyn Beckham on Twitter, you see all these stan accounts, which honestly blew my mind because I was like, okay, the Posh Girls were like a 90s thing. Like this is from like when I was like so young. Like, so how old are the actual audience for, I guess they were kind of millennial, but also kind of like Gen X even, because it was really the 90s that they started often. But then you see these stan accounts that frankly are run by, I know they're not being run by like 45-year-olds. I'm sure they're just, because they're like pop stan accounts. Although, I don't know, it's Club Chalamet hasn't weighed in, but for instance, like this one, it says, I need Brooklyn Beckham to understand that some of us were never going to be on his side. Posh was our mother before he was hers. Then you see all these pictures from, like the early 2000s. And maybe it's just part of like Gen Z, early 2000s, like revival, where it's like, we love her, we stan her, she's a skinny legend, but it's depressing.
I find those tweets to be so like unbelievable on their face. I'm like, do you hear yourself? You sound crazy when you say things like this. Like, she was our mother. She was not actually your mother. It reminds me of how Trump supporters behave. It reminds me a lot of how Johnny Depp supporters behave, because they like also post pictures of him from the 90s and are like, how could this heartthrob ever abuse anyone? And it's like a lot of times older Gen X women and millennial women, and sometimes even like so-called liberal people in this demographic jump on these bandwagons.
Oh, they're all like liberal. I mean, I think some of these women that claim to be liberals are some of the most misogynistic. I don't know. Some of it really does remind me most recently of the Blake Lively stuff, because you see people saying, like, for instance, pulling up this post that Nicola had posted after October 7th, where she reposted the State of Israel's Instagram account saying, I stand with Israel. Again, like her father is a hardcore Zionist. It reminds me of people just being like, oh, well, Blake had her wedding at a Southern plantation, so XYZ. It's like, I think that people look for moral purity from these women, and it's like they can still experience misogyny, and Brooklyn Beckham can still be like, involved in this fundamentally misogynistic hate campaign, even though they're not great people,
Oh, 100%. And in fact, like, these campaigns are more successful when they're deployed against problematic people, because then there's like a whole like, well, I always hated her, and like, well, she sucks, so I don't care if this is happening to her. Like, these smear campaign victims, it's no coincidence that they oftentimes like have these track records. It is the perfect victim fallacy, like, at its core. And if people use these moral purity tests to evaluate whether someone is experiencing harm, then that invalidates all people who are experiencing harm because you will always be able to find reasons to not support someone. It's the exact same logic that like the Trump administration uses against like targets of ICE. So when people like fail these like logical tests, it just like shows how they can become easily swayed to be more conservative, period.
Well, Kat, thank you so much for being on here today to chat about all this.
Oh my gosh, I had such a good time talking about this.
All right, that's it for the show. If you like this episode, please buy a paid subscription to my tech and online culture newsletter at usermag.co. That's usermag.co, where I do a bi-weekly roundup of everything that I'm seeing and reading online. You can also get my newsletter on my Patreon, which is linked below. On my Patreon, I do bonus episodes of Power User, monthly Q&As. You can find the full video on demand of my live streams. I have zero long-term advertisers right now. So seriously, I cannot produce this show without your direct financial support, and I can't thank you enough. Every single dollar makes such a difference. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Power User. See you then.